Okay, good morning, Carrie.
Hi, everyone.
Did you have thunderstorms in Barcelona this morning?
I didn't hear any thunder, but it did rain quite heavily.
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
we're like, what's
I could hear the thunder up in the mountains, but
right?
it kind of passed us by. Yeah. Good morning, Sinem. How are
Hello,
you?
hello everyone.
Recovered? You're feeling better now.
Oh, yes, yes, thank you very much.
Good.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning, Leonilda. Good morning, Ruthie. Good afternoon. I mean, good evening. Cecilia's joining us, but she's a bit under the weather, she tells me. So she's going to sit quietly in the background because of her jab. But I hope you get over that, Cecilia. Adrienne joining us from.
Yeah, hello everyone.
Hi, Cecilia. Okay. Well, I think we can probably get going. Let me just share my screen. We'll just remind ourselves where we are. Session 7. And just one more session to go. So thank you all of you for answering. This is the results to date. I'll keep it open a little bit longer, but I think it's just by a short head, as they say in horse racing. It looks like Donald Freeman is the winner. So that's chapter 17 on teacher training. So let's make that decision now. And I'll post it in an email to remind you, and those of us who are not here. But I did also appreciate somebody said I would prefer to have a question and answer session. So I don't think that's incompatible with also looking at a book chapter. So we'll put some time aside in this last session for a general wrap up, free for all question and answer on the book and the course as a whole, reflecting on some of the common threads and themes that have come up. So let's make that a decision then. Chapter 17, Donald Freeman, and I'll notify you by email, or Barb will. Okay, and then this is the chapter today, and I got to cut. Oh, yeah, this is. I thought I'd share this with you. This is a photo of me and Leo van Leer, taken in northern Cyprus over 10 years ago, before his untimely death. I don't know whether you noticed in the preface of our book, there's a mention of the fact that the very final stages of the book's preparation, the contributors very sad to learn of the passing of our esteemed colleague Leo van Leer. His light will continue to shine. And I would like to kind of make this session a tribute to him. His was a very important influence, or is still, on my thinking. And he was also a delightful man, companion. I met him at a number of conferences around the world. Had no idea at this stage that he was ill. But he also was a great speaker and a very engaging writer, as I hope I can demonstrate, if not from this chapter, from other pieces of his writing. So this is our kind of tribute session to Leo. And these are the questions I thought we could think about I'll post these into the chat. Hang on. I'll post these into the chat. I have them saved somewhere. Margaret, you're going to have to teach me how to use Padlet for the next time we run this, because it'll be a lot easier, I know. But those are the questions. If you want to cut and paste. I mean, basically, the three distinctions that he explores in his chapter: control and initiative, constraints and resources, and structure and process. And I like to kind of explore those together, but I'll give you a chance to talk about them in your breakout rooms. Before I do that, who's just joined us? Christine, hi. Fabio, hi.
Hi.
Margaret thanks for posting, Margaret. I haven't had a chance to respond to your post about Padlet, etc., but it was really, really interesting. I recommend those of you who haven't been into the forum to have a look at the contributions from Fabio, Girish, and Margaret on the subject of constraints, etc. So, any questions before I move you into your rooms? Okay, we're 17, 16. Let's say 5 rooms, yeah. Okay, so again, another 10, 12, 15 minutes. I'll move around, see how you're doing. You know how to contact me if you have any questions. And let's hope we have no late comers while I'm out of the plenary. So there are your rooms. And off you go. Recording. I'm frustrated that I can't find that quote by Stevic about focusing on the process as opposed to the product or the outcomes, but you recognize it, yeah? Hi, everybody.
We had questions about that too, Scott, on page 246, this process and structure and process. If you could talk a little bit about it.
Yes, okay, definitely. The distinction that Stevic makes, I think, is that I was trying to find is between, it's more about what I would call product versus process, which is he says somewhere that when he started teaching, he was more focused on the products of the lesson, you know, the outcomes, the lesson aims, the objectives, whatever you want to call them, which is what we as teacher trainers try to encourage, you know, learners, teachers, learning teachers, new teachers to think about. But then as he became more experienced and more confident, etc., and more relaxed, I guess, he started to focus more on the process of the actual learning, including the individual learning styles, if you like, of the learners. And so that was the distinction he was making. And now he focuses, he says he focuses 100% on the process. And that's why he's interested in these methodologies that are also seen to be more focused on the learning process than the outcomes of learning. But I'll come back to that in a minute when I start. I've got a couple more quotes, one from Adrian Underhill, where he describes his definition of process. Were there any other things that came up in your discussions that you want to ask about at this point, or mention, or on that, even specifically on that issue of process versus structure? All good? Let me just spot check and get some feedback from the groups I didn't visit. So Anna, in your group, what was the focus of the discussion? Anna Viti.
Yeah, we talked about control and initiative, which was quite interesting because I think nowadays we are considering giving the initiative more to students, but I think we're still afraid of, how can I say, not to control things so much. Yeah, and we discussed that. We discussed about the controlling initiative. About the process and structure, we were in doubt. I was in doubt about it. We discussed a little bit, but I wouldn't be able to tell you my conclusions really. Maybe Christine and Catherine and James could help me with that.
Any volunteers? Because I agree. I don't think his example in that section was that clear. I'm just trying to find it.
Well, it made me think a bit about
146.
procedural syllabuses and negotiated syllabuses as the structure, of the course coming out retrospectively through the negotiation process. But the feeling that we had about that is that that's a bit too superficial. I think he's going on to a deeper level here in the example given. It's more on an interactional level of the day-to-day teaching that the example covers.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's the key, actually. It's the learning is in the interaction. The path is made by walking kind of idea. So I'll hold that idea and I'll come back and I want to share my kind of thoughts on that, and particularly the work that Leo Van Leer did, whole books he wrote about two books about classroom interaction. So this was very much his interest and focus. And I think he's got a lot of original thoughts on that topic. And it relates to this, as you say, the process, if you like. You're more interested in the process, the interaction, the talk in the classroom rather than the syllabus, curriculum outcomes, etc. But I think there is, you're right, James, I think there is an element of a connection here with the notion of process syllabuses, negotiated syllabuses, etc. also. And this comes back to this other distinction between initiative versus control, and that giving the learners some initiative in designing, it's to some degree, the syllabus or the content or the processes by talking to them, by listening to them, by asking them, etc. As Fabio mentions in his very illuminating post in the forum. So let's just hold a couple of these ideas. Let me just see what other group we have. How about, well, Fabio, from your group, what did you focus on?
Well, we talked about the fact that this was a difficult chapter, full of not easily, with topics that were not easy to grasp. But I could talk about control because this is one thing that I kind of studied and understood. And to me, the difference between initiative and control is not very clear, because if we give our students some initiative, it means that we're giving them control. So I don't really see what the difference is between the two terms. We talked about giving control, empowering learners in EFL context, because Ruth Leonilde, is that correct? Leonilde, we all teach in EFL context. So we talked about the fact that having students, so students basically come to the lesson 1 hour a week, 2 hours a week for a year, but then they don't do maybe enough between lessons. So learner training, which is part of learner autonomy, developing learner autonomy, is one important thing. Training learners how to learn and let them know how to, our second language is learned, is one of our roles. But I don't know if this is really what we were supposed to talk about. So I don't know. It all comes down to control. I mean, that was the topic, and then we, you know, we took a different.
Yeah. I think even Leo Van Leer tries to distance himself a little bit from Stevik's notion that you can have 100% learner initiative and 100% teacher control. That doesn't seem to square very well with how, as you say, how we understand control. So again, I'll come back to that point. Maybe I'll start addressing these topics now, and I can divide the kind of presentation stage into two. One which looks at some of these distinctions made in the article, and then the other part of this presentation part, we'll look at the work on interaction, because I think that's the practical stuff that really gets to the nitty gritty in terms of classroom interaction. So this is the Stevik quote that we've discussed. It's come up before in the forums, etc., where he says, there is a way of defining control and initiative which allows the teacher to keep nearly 100% of the control at the same time the learner is exercising nearly 100% of the initiative. And this is a point he comes back to a number of times, that when he visits a class, for example, he said, hey, remember, we talked about this last week, the difference between an authority or being authoritative and being authoritarian. And so 100% control does not mean being being authoritarian, but it does mean being an authority and being able to, particularly, and he talks about this a number of times, giving the way we give feedback to learners, so that they can talk about what they want, but my job as a teacher is to shape the language that comes up, the emergent language, and that is in a sense exercising control. I'm the scaffolder, and that's my job as a teacher. And to sort of abdicate from that role would disempower the learners, because they wouldn't have any sense of whether they're saying is target-like or whatever, that kind of thing. So, and the other distinction, the one between constraints and resources, I think is a useful one. And this is from the book, which I can totally recommend. This is from the Interaction in the Language Curriculum. It's one of those books that, for me, it was so influential. I remember when I started reading it. I mean, I'm exactly where I was. I was in the airport of Palma de Mallorca waiting for a flight, and I was just completely gripped by this book. So he uses the analogy of chess, and he talks about that in the article too, that chess, there are moves, there are rules, and you have to obey the rules to be able to play the game, kind of thing. And that, and he says the same, he uses that metaphor for the educational game, which is a dynamic interplay between constraints and resources. And of course, if you think about language, it's a dynamic interplay between constraints and resources, because you have the grammar, which is the constraint. You can't depart from the grammar, or you can, but at your peril. But the grammar provides a resource to create an unlimited or infinite number of sentences, according to Chomsky, kind of thing. So you've got the constraint is actually created. We'll look at an example of that in a minute. But he goes on to say, if there is excessive control, so this is the authoritarian teacher, and we're told exactly what to do and when to do it, then education ceases to be education. If, on the other hand, we reject all constraints, so no rules, no syllabus, no curriculum, no objectives, no exams, then education will likewise be impossible, since it will degenerate into chaos. And he goes on now, this is where the process, he mentions process. The process curriculum consists of exploring, articulating, examining, and developing the constraints and resources in the educational setting. So coming back to James's point, jointly exploring, articulating, and examining. So it could be negotiated. There's no reason not to. And there's lovely examples. Girish's example in the forum about giving the learners a measure of control, but in baby steps. And I'm very grateful, Girish, for you mentioning Jim Scrivener's book, marvelous book, on classroom management techniques. I have to declare an interest here because I edited it and worked with Jim on this. But I mean, and so Girish refers to, I think that, Fabio, was it?
Yeah,
It was Fabio, sorry, yeah.
no problem.
Girish referred to the baby steps kind of approach, one step at a time. But Fabio mentioned the options that Jim Scrivener gives in this book as to how to kind of start devolving responsibility onto the learners to give them more initiative. And one of his first points is start small. Don't jump in at the deep end. And so on. And then he says, point 5, make any constraints absolutely clear. Don't delude the learners into thinking they have complete freedom. There are constraints. There's an exam, maybe. There's a textbook they have to use. The parents are expecting X, Y, and Z, etc. So we need to talk about those constraints and work within them. So thank you for mentioning that, Fabio. And now this is a bit more on process. This is from Adrian Underhill's, a really, really great article he wrote many, many years ago in the English Language Teaching Journal. So this is how he defines process. It's the way in which the content of the lesson syllabus is taught. And he adds to that, it's from the point of view of the learner. So it's their experience of how the lesson syllabus or curriculum is taught, their perception of it. And so it comes back to this question of relevance, which has come up again and again in all this discussion about humanistic language of learning processes, that learners need to see the relevance of what's going on. And he goes on to say, process focuses on the immediate subjective reality of the individuals in a learning group, from their perspective, their point of view. And the way that they relate to themselves is concerned with how participants relate to themselves and each other in order to carry out the task of learning, but also the individual tasks within the lesson. Whatever contributes to the ambient learning atmosphere and the classroom dynamic, including the attitudes, values, and awareness of the teacher and of the learners as part of the process. So it's the whole consort dancing together, or whatever the line is. It's not just an intellectual endeavor, it's also an emotional one. It involves everybody in the room. Oh, here's an activity for you. So taking those, and those of you who've done the dogma course with me will recognize this activity. And I used to do it in the old days in the classroom. So you'd have an imaginary map of the world, if you like, on the floor, with north at that end of the room, south at that end, east, west, etc. But we can do it just as well here. So, and so we've got two parameters here. I want you to think about your own teaching. And this is not judgmental. I mean, this is not a test. It's simply because we all work, as Girish pointed out in the form, we work with different constraints in our local context, and the educational context and the age of the learners and all stuff like that, of course, are going to determine how much control you have. So if we take if we take that the vertical axis as being plus control versus minus control, so maximum control on the part of the teacher to minus control. I want you to think where you put yourself typically in your classroom. And I'm going to give you an opportunity in a minute to answer this in the chat. So whether you are way up at the top, in the North Pole of control, or you're way down in the South Pole of control. I suspect nobody's in the South Pole of negative control, of complete freedom. And then think of this other axis cutting across that between a focus on the products of learning versus a focus on the process of learning. So again, position yourself along that line. I mean, this is not, this is not scientific. I'm not pretending it is for a second. So for example, if you're very much focused on the products and the outcomes of learning, then you'll be over there by Mexico. Whereas if you are, the other end, etc. So position yourself in the map of the world, and then into the chat, write what country you are in when you take into account those two parameters. Yeah. So I'm just opening the chat here. James is in Manila. Great, James. You've got the idea. So you're at the kind of more process end, but you're fairly in the middle in terms of control. Yeah, it's just sort of, you're on the equator there. And Katarina is the north of Australia. Wow, gosh, I'm impressed. You're down in my hemisphere. And Fabio's in India, not literally, but yeah. So you're okay. You're not that far away from where James is, possibly. And Christine is up in Russia and Moscow. So you're quite high control, but more process inclined. Yeah. Anna Maria down near James, Ruthie, similar Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asia. Oh, Leonilda is Bermuda. So we're going across the other side of the map. So very focused on the product, but midway in terms of the control. Yeah, fascinating. And then we're whooping back. Cinemas back with the others in Southeast Asia. And of course, yeah, I mean, this is going to vary according to the day of the week, which class you're teaching, et cetera, et cetera. And also the difference between online and face-to-face too is going to have something to do with it. Elvira, so you're quite central, Elvira. Yeah, you're practically bang in the middle there in Iraq. That's probably a safe place to be. Now, I could extend this activity and ask you, okay, that's where you are. Where would you like to be, or where do you envisage yourself as being in X years' time or whatever as a continually developing teacher? But I'm not going to go there yet because, but you've got the idea. Those of you who are teacher trainers might like to adapt this activity too, because it's not just about control or product versus process, but you can have teacher-centered versus learner-centered, you can have, etc. There's various ways of constructing, but great. But it gives me an idea. So we've got quite a concentration down in the Philippines with a sort of more inclined to process and mid control, but we've got a few outliers. Okay, James.
Yeah, coming from Manila, I'd rather be in North Australia, but the expectations of my learners, they want me to exercise more control. So I keep giving them, options and asking what they'd like, but they say, well, no, you decide. Or so I get this, kind of control forced upon me.
Yes, absolutely. And the very last slide I'm going to show is Leo Van Leer acknowledging that we all work within different constraints, but at the same time, it's what we need to do as developing teachers is look for the wiggle room, the bits of that. And I mean, this comes up endlessly in discussions of dogma. How much freedom have people got to throw out the course book or the syllabus or the exams? Well, very few people have that freedom. So what you do is you work within the constraints, but you try to move yourself. If you want to be less controlling, or you want to be more process oriented, yes, as you say, you're trying to move yourself to Northern Australia or even New Zealand in the long term. But yes. Any other comments there while we're talking?
It also depends on the context. For example, I was thinking of one-to-one lessons. One-to-one lesson, you might be, I might be in Antarctica in terms of control. So absolutely. You tell me what you want to focus on, what you're struggling with, and we'll go from there.
But I think you probably wouldn't be in Antarctica, because if you define control again as being the teacher's interventions in terms of scaffolding, so the initiative would be the learner, but you would be you know, the learner would be disappointed if you weren't doing something with their particular, but you're absolutely right. The one-to-one situation is in a sense ideal for this kind of negotiated, learner initiated model of pedagogy. And it's, you know, the challenge is, how can we, if we believe in that, that's a good thing, how can we adapt that one-to-one relationship or dynamic into a larger group of students? You know, how is it possible? And this is the challenge with dogma, I think, because dogma works fine one-to-one. I mean, you know, how else would you do a one-to-one class, as you say? But, you know, how can you adapt that to all the other constraints and the complications of having lots of different individuals in the room? Let's just move on. I just want to show you, this is a fun thing that it's in the context of constraints and control, and the idea of creativity being not having no constraints. In fact, the more constraints you have, the more creative in a sense you can be. And this is an activity, it's described to a woman called Lynn. I'll give you the reference in a second. So she gets the students to do these so-called acrostics. Acrostic is a poem where you've got the first letter of each line. So they've got to write a poem jointly about school where the first line begins with an S. And so, and she describes this is one group, these are in Hong Kong, I think. So one group came up with study hard, competition with other students to get high grades are our obligation to make our parents love us. Isn't that brilliant? But what's interesting is that she has a transcript of the negotiation that went into constructing this. And so they're really, 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 really working hard to do this. And she does another one with joy. And she goes on to say, formal constraints lead to complex and creative language use, transforming familiar utterances into unfamiliar ones, shaping and reshaping learners' language. So this is where constraints offer a resource, completely consistent with what Van Leer is saying. In creativity theory, change and innovation can occur by the addition of constraints, and creativity is facilitated by constraints. So I just throw that in as an example of, now, what I want to do now is focus on this book, which is heavy going and expensive. But if you're interested in pursuing a lot of these lines, and particularly this notion of ecological theory and how it relates to learning, then this is the book. I think his last complete book, in fact. Not like this early one, which he wrote 1995, Language Awareness, but there's a consistency running through all his writing, which he's incredibly eclectic, and particularly in this ecology book, he draws in all sorts of different disciplines. It's not just about linguistics, it's not just about language teaching, but it's science, complexity theory, blah, blah, blah. He anticipated Diane Larson Freeman to a certain extent in discovering or seeing the connections between complexity theory and language learning and language. So this is his kind of definition of the ecological approach. And there's the P word in the very last line. It's the study of movement, process, and action. And action, of course, relates to meaningful action, which is the title of our book. So it's the more expansive view of language learning that sees it as being a kind of nested phenomenon. The classroom, of course, is an option, but it's not necessary. Language learning can take place in the wild. And it needn't require institutions, but typically your kind of default learning situation is of the individual in classrooms, in institutions, nested in local community with all the values and beliefs of that community, the nation state, the language spoken in the nation state, and the world and the universe. And of course, it's not just about the learner. You know, if you looking at the learner has their own kind of ecology. They're not just a mind. You're not just a robot with a kind of, you know, brain. They have feelings and experiences, etc. They are whole people. So again, I think this quote captures that notion again of initiative on the part of the learner, that they, and responsibility and autonomy, that they, yeah, and of centering the lessons around the learners as much as possible, because that only that way will they become relevant. Now, this is a big, tall order. I mean, and he, as I say, later on we'll see that he's perfectly aware of the fact that teachers work within constraints. And this theory, ecological theory, sort of goes back in time, pre-ecology, if you like, to this book, very important book on education generally, called Situated Learning, which came out in 1990 something, one. But it's a core text, and most, if you study education or philosophy of education, this is very much core text, because again, it's looking at the way learning is always situated, and it's situated in communities, and being a learner means joining a small community, you know, becoming a legitimate part of that community, even if you're only on the outside initially. And this is particularly the case, of course, with language learning. So learning is not just about internalizing information. Yeah, it's not just about taking on board a lot of facts. The Battle of Hastings was fought in 1066, that kind of thing. But learning is seen as increasing participation in communities of practice, and it concerns the whole person acting in the world. So again, Leo van Leer, the whole person and the ecological thing, acting in the world and acting in the world. So all these key words: participation, communities, wholeness, and action. So this, as I say, predates a lot of this discussion, and all these people like Leo van Leer, of course, allude to this particular book. Very thin, readable book, actually. And so he uses that in his book on ecology, he uses the term participation. Language learning emerges from participation. So it's a different, and some people have made this distinction between what's called the participation metaphor versus the acquisition metaphor. And traditionally, language learning has always been seen in terms of acquisition, second language acquisition. We kind of acquire this thing, which is the second language, bit by bit, grammar item by grammar item, and we internalize it. But this more ecological view sees it as being participation in a community of practice, and that there is historical, cultural, institutional systems impacting on this. And he uses the metaphor of football, of kids learning, sort of teaching each other how to play a game like football, where they kind of just kick the ball around initially in a kind of idle sort of way. And the rules kind of emerge. Yeah, they become learnable. They become shared, etc., in an interaction between bottom-up discovery, but also, importantly, top-down instruction. So somebody who knows a little bit more about it is probably telling them, no, you've got to, you're not allowed to pick the ball, or an adult or whatever. So it's not just discovery. It's not just experiential learning. There is top-down instruction. And also there's the whole history of having watched games on television and heard people talking about football, etc., within the social context, you see. So he uses this as an analogy for language learning too. Yeah, that it's learnable through this interaction between bottom-up discovering stuff about the language as you use it, but also top-down instruction. Now, the top-down instruction is where the teacher obviously is key. And this is, again, comes back to this thing of control. Top-down instruction implies a degree of control by the person who's giving the top-down construction. Now, I'm just going to flash through this because I don't, but I'll give you the reference. This just comes from my blog post on ecology, where I summarize basically the book in 6 points. So the ecological approach is concerned with relations, context, which we keep mentioning, and patterns and systems, which is clearly with patterns, language has patterns and systems, but it sees these in a more holistic way, perhaps. And then emergence, a key word in these in ecology, and also in conflict. Diane Larson Freeman, we saw last week, diversity and activity. And now, as I say, I'm just going to leave this with you. You can go back to this, but if you want to read more on that, then that's the link to the blog on ecology, and where I just simply summarize Leo van Leer. A key concept in all this is the notion of affordances. And he writes about, and this is a term borrowed from, co-opted from the study of natural systems, ecology. So affordances means basically opportunities. But one thing can be an opportunity for one learner, but not for another. Yeah. So, I mean, he uses the example of a leaf. So for a caterpillar, a leaf offers food. Yeah. For some birds, a leaf offers shelter. For some animals, a leaf offers camouflage, disguise, and literally, shelter or nesting, home, and then shelter from the rain. So in other words, depending on your position in the ecological system, the leaf will provide different affordances. And Leo van Leer uses this metaphor, if you like, to talk about language affordances. He quotes, this is from a book. And he says, this Ouyang or whoever it is says, in terms of language learning, affordances arise out of participation and use. So we pick up things from other students. I mean, that's a well-known phenomenon. We hear other students say things, we pick them up. We pick things up from the teacher. We pick things up from the text we're reading. But different learners will pick up different things. Again, and I think we talked about this last week, where learners will take different things out of. Did I tell you? I talked about the prepositions woman. Didn't I?
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah, you did.
I repeat myself. So they're the key words again: participation, use, affordances, all bundled together. I just skipped that. You can go back to that. It's just a nice description by a learner in China. Well, actually, it is kind of cool. When she learned English in China, she was a Chinese learner of English in China. It was just like a road that you followed. Yeah, it was like the curriculum, the syllabus. But when she moved to Australia as an exchange student or whatever, it was like it was a forest. Yeah, there was language all around you. And you just walked through and you explored things. And I love this metaphor. It's a whole article based on it. One of the co-writers of the article being Phil Benson, who's written a lot about, in fact, Benson, Fabio, that's you mentioned his distinction between 3 types of control. So Van Leer goes on to say, the environment is full of meaning potential. The environment is full of meaning potential, which is not necessarily the case of classrooms, textbooks, or pedagogical interactions, at least not as they were traditionally realized. They don't offer the rich semiotic meaning, meaning-laden budget. They are not, so this goes back to the forest, the Chinese woman in Australia. There's a rich semiotic budget out there in the world, which may not be necessarily found in traditional classrooms. And so the whole thrust of Van Leer's ecological approach is to increase, at least, the semiotic budget of classrooms, and particularly to do that of pedagogical interactions. And this is where we get into, as I said, the kind of nitty gritty, the pedagogical interactions. What does he mean by that? Well, important distinction that he spends a lot of time talking about is the one between these two kinds of questions. And I'm just using a slide here that I've taken from a training course I'm doing at a moment with some teachers online. Have I shown you this before? No. Okay. So this is a question for the course. Yeah. So I put up this and say, okay, into the chat box, tell me what's the difference between A and B. And clearly it doesn't require a lot of, or maybe it does. I mean, for some teachers, this is a completely new concept. The difference between so-called display questions, how many fingers have I got? Now, it's very unlikely that the person asking that question doesn't know. I mean, you can imagine a kind of bizarre situation where somebody might say to somebody else, how many fingers have I got? Because they don't know. But normally, the idea is that it's to elicit the answer 5, yeah? Just as in a geography class, what's the capital of Peru? Answer Lima, yeah? Now the teacher knows the answer, but the teacher's asking the learner so they can display their knowledge. So they're called display questions, as opposed to how many brothers have you got? Well, so assuming I don't know, I'm asking you a real question because I actually don't know the answer. So this is the kind of question which supposedly, which people do ask in real life. People don't ask display questions in real life, except when they're talking to children, very young children. So what's your name? What's your mummy's name? What's your dolly's name? That kind of thing. But no, normally they are the exclusive providence of classrooms. And of course, they come in sequences. And this is the next thing to draw teachers' attention to, that they're not asked they're not asked in isolation. But first of all, I show them this dialogue. It's an invented dialogue, but they've got to, the teachers I'm working with have got to identify which ones are display questions and which ones are real questions. So what's your favorite snack, Yusuf, is a real question. And then he says pickled vegetables. Teacher says, what's a pickle? That's a display question. And then the teacher goes back, okay, Yusuf, pickled what? So he doesn't, so it's a real question. And then so is number 4, a real question. So there's an interesting balance. We're not to say that display questions are bad. It's just that if they're only display questions, of course, maybe learners, the conversation is limited. And we'll come back to that point in a minute. But these display questions are asked typically in these three-part sequences. What's this? A triangle, right? Yeah. Where is Fiji in Africa? No. Yeah. A question, answer, and response. And they are commonly called IRF sequences. So the initiation, the response, and the follow-up or the evaluation. James.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out in the display question you just showed us, what's a pickle, is actually asked for the benefit of other students in the group rather than from the teacher's own benefit. There's a real purpose behind it, I think.
Yes, exactly. And this is why it would be unwise to dismiss the value of display questions. And I think this comes back again to this question of control. It's where the teacher wants to control the interaction to a certain extent, to share it around, to make sure everybody's understanding. And it also comes back to this thing of restraints. There's a restraint on classroom discourse. There has to be. It's not just conversation. We'll come back to that point in a minute. It's a certain kind of conversation. So it's constrained, not restrained, constrained. To a certain extent, it's not entirely free. We're not just chatting to fill the time. So yes, good point, James. And here again, this is where I get the trainees to see how these things work in sequence. So you've got sequence A, which starts off with how many fingers have you got? 5. Good. Ask me. How many fingers have you got? 5. Good. Ask Helen. How many fingers have you got? 5. So you can see that it's a very constrained kind of dialogue, conversation, not conversation at all. Whereas how many brothers have you got? 5. 5. Wow. Who's the oldest? Walid. How old is he? 27. Is he? What does he do? He's an engineer. Really? Okay. Ask Khalid. Khalid, how many brothers have you got? And so on. So here you have a much more unpredictable, to a large extent, conversation, but a much longer one, and we can go on indefinitely, and also a much more engaging one, arguably. And that's the point that Van Leer is making in another article called Constraints and Resources in Classroom Talk. And he is passionate about this point about, giving students opportunities to exercise initiative or to develop a sense of control and self-regulation. Yeah, so moving the control to them, a sense of ownership of the discourse, a sense of being empowered. All these worthy aims are extremely restricted in the IRF format, how many fingers have I got kind of conversation. And yet, when you look at classroom interaction in any subject, not just in language classes, you find that a good proportion of the questions are display questions, and it's very much these kinds of sequences, because it's the teacher's control over the direction of the lesson. So we're coming back to this thing of the process now. The process is very different in these two sequences. And what Van Leer is saying, and a lot of people are saying, well, maybe we should be moving more towards sequence B without necessarily sacrificing the need for, as James points out, display questions which can help regulate the understanding of the rest of the class, who may be simply the audience for parts of these conversations at least. So a lot of these books, the one on interaction, particularly this one, but in an earlier book on the classroom and the language learner, which I suspect was his kind of PhD written up, is about display questions versus, and he's not saying, as I said before, he's not saying we shouldn't ask display questions, but he says if we don't ever ask real questions, then the learners are never going to get to the stage where they've got a sense of control. And there's another quote coming up. And he's quite emphatic actually in this earlier book. True conversational teaching must at some point break out of the IRF, initiate, respond, feedback mold, if it is to allow students to develop their own voice. So this is again, so the pendulum swing between student initiative and control is not going to happen if the teacher is so controlling that the students never answer, let alone ask real questions. And the students we haven't talked about that yet, but the student asking questions, of course, is another whole dimension to classroom interaction, which is very broad. We talked about it in the breakout rooms, the group I was visiting. So Leo Van Leer references the work of these two educationalists who coined the term instructional conversation. Now, again, forgive me, those of you who did the dogma course, but I think it's an important distinction, because this sort of brings together the two polarities of control and initiative. So control, instruction, but initiative, who has the initiative in a conversation? Well, everybody, it's distributed. Nobody's nominating somebody to talk in a normal conversation in the real world. So they coined the term instructional conversation. And you can read the And of course, if you compare traditional instruction with real life conversation, you see that they are poles apart in some respects. And this is my way of showing those distinctions. I don't want to go into all this in any detail, but the key points here, perhaps number 3, that teaching instruction typically is teacher-led, whereas conversation, a real conversation, is jointly constructed. So can we move the classroom to be something that's more jointly constructed? Christine.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question. As far as I remember from the psychology, a person who asks question is in the control of the situation, of the dialogue. So does it mean that as soon as we give our students the right or the ground to ask questions, everyone, including the teacher, we automatically give the control, pass the control to them in the discussion?
This is such a great question. And I actually have a talk I did a couple of years ago at IATEFL about exactly that, about giving learners, letting learners, encouraging learners, and giving learners a space to ask questions. And as a thought experiment, you know, how far can you go with that thing? And coming back to Fabio's point, was it about one-to-one? Clearly with a one-to-one student, you could almost say, okay, you know, on first contact, you could say, okay, ask me. Well, first of all, tell me what you want, and then ask me. And I'd often thought this would be an interesting way of teaching grammar at particularly at kind of intermediate remedial levels. Is say, okay, next lesson, Margaret, this relates to you and your Padlets actually. Next lesson, we're going to do a review of the present perfect continuous, or the first condition, or whatever, yeah, or something you may have identified, or they may have identified as being problematic. But I'm not going to teach you anything. You're going to come with questions. So that's your homework, or you put them onto the Padlet or whatever. Yeah. If you don't have any questions, we'll do something else. We'll play a game. We'll read a text. We'll go home. I'd love to do that and see what would happen. And I think you could learn a lot about where learners are by the kinds of questions they ask. I mean, we give presentations, don't we? Grammar talk, traditionally, we used to, and we'd do our brilliant presentation of the present perfect continuous. And then we'd say at the end, like, you know, it's 1 minute before the end of the lesson, say, any questions? And you deliberately look away from anyone because you don't want them to ask you questions. Because inexperienced teachers, their biggest fear is that they will be exposed. I remember I had students when my first 2 months of teaching, I was teaching, can you believe it? I was teaching sailors from the Persian or Iranian Navy. We had a big contract at a school I was teaching at in the south of England. And we had these Marines, let's call them, and they were naughty. I mean, they were young. They were out to have a good time. And they were also out to expose the teacher, particularly the new teacher like me. And so one of them suddenly put up his hand in the lesson and said, excuse me, Mr. Scott, can you tell us the grammar of I wish? Okay, right. I say, yeah, well, I wish I had a lot of money. I wish I was whatever, wasn't living in Hastings. And they said, but why had? Don't you wish it now? And I'd never thought of this in all my life. I had never thought, I never realized that we use the past after wish for something now. I wish I had. I was completely and utterly exposed. I mean, you end up saying, well, that's just what we say. And the students go, no, that's not good enough. What's the rule? Terrible. I rushed to the staff room after and said, well, why do we say I wish I had? We've all been there. But yes, Christine, that's such an interesting question. And I think let's just quickly run with that and look at the implications of all this. And just on that list, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious what the terms mean, but the last one is something that Van Leer writes about a lot in this book, and that's contingency. And contingency basically means connectedness. Things are connected. So in a real conversation, there's high contingency. Things are connected to the world around you. You point at something, say, look at that lovely, and you have a conversation about it. So it's connected to the context. But it's also, one utterance is connected to the next. As people talk, they connect what they say to what somebody's just said, and they do it very explicitly using connectors like, oh, that reminds me, or well, or right, okay, or oh, etc. So we use all these kinds of pragmatic markers to connect things. Whereas in teaching, things are not necessarily, a question like, how many fingers have I got, is not connected to the context. It's not connected to what somebody's just said. It doesn't actually invite a great deal of talk to follow, etc. So that's what we mean by contingency. So what we're trying to do, what Van Leer is trying to do, he talks constantly, is how can we make classroom talk more contingent? So this is Rod Ellis, a paper he wrote, which I've lost. It grieves me. I had a photocopy of it and I can't find it. So I guess I'll have to buy the book it came from. But it's a great article, actually, where Rod Ellis talks about discourse control. Discourse control, and giving it the control to the learners through the kinds of initiatives that Christine was suggesting, yeah, by getting them to ask at least some of the questions. So Ellis said, opportunities for giving learners control of the discourse will arise naturally in the course of a language lesson. The opportunities or affordances, they will come up. We know that. No lesson is so predictable and controlled that things don't come up. Things will come up. Now, the extent to which teachers grasp these opportunities, says Ellis, may well prove more crucial for creating the optimal conditions for acquisition to take place than any planned decisions they make. So here we have the contrast between planning and improvising or being spontaneous or being responsive. And I think this is where the process product distinction kicks in too. So if we're focusing on what these things that come up, we're focusing on the process as opposed to, no, we can't talk about that because it's not in my lesson plan. How many times have we done that or seen that done or inflicted that on teachers in courses like the Delta, etc., saying you've got to teach the lesson plan. You've got to have a clear aim. Yeah, the lesson isn't successful unless you reach the aim and can prove that the aim has been achieved, as if you were training penguins to catch fish. So I like that quote and I love that whole article. I'm going to skip that one. And then now that I'm closing now, I'm just giving a couple of last comments from Van Leer. And he says, this is where he talks about, he knows that we are often constrained in our syllabuses, etc., without ignoring or wishing away the very real and often debilitating constraints that adhere in many institutional settings. A teacher who keeps a clear view of the basic ecological principles can ignite sparks of interest that in turn can set in motion perceptual, social, and cognitive processes that instigate learning. I mean, he needn't have said it in quite so many big words, but basically we're saying if you keep your eye on the process, you have this kind of ecological view where, again, talk about contingency, you can pick up on things and relate them to the cultural context, etc., the learner's context, and so on. If you keep your eye on that, even though you have to teach the lesson plan, even though you have to prepare the students for the exam, you will find what we call in the dogma group, dogma moments, moments when you can exploit the stuff that comes up, ignite sparks of interest. And these, it's like the butterfly wing effect, the butterfly flaps its wings in the Philippines and it causes a storm in Texas. Those little sparks of interest may well be the trigger for some learners, at least, to make that lesson one of the most memorable lessons they ever had. And very finally, and then again, I love this quote, talking about changes in the curriculum. It's not about changing the method. It's not about changing the textbook, but it's about changing the interaction. reform, curricular reform thus occurs from the bottom up, from the interactions between the people in the room, one pedagogical action at a time. Coming back to, I think, Girish's point in the forum about baby steps, if you change the way you ask questions in the class, this is my thesis, and it's Leo Van Leer's thesis. If you change the kinds of questions you ask, or if you get the learners to ask more questions, you can change the whole curriculum. It just changes. He talks about, coming back to football again. You can make, tiny changes in the rules of football, and they don't really change the game. He mentions the offside rule. If anybody knows anything about football or soccer, you'll know the offside rule, and you can change it. People do change it over time. But if you change the rule about being able to pick the ball up, you change the game. You say, okay, let's play soccer, but we can pick the ball up. Well, it's no longer soccer. And he's saying the same thing about teaching. If you change, there's certain changes that don't change things, but there are other changes that can have a major knock-on effect. And I think that's the point about questions. So that's my tribute to Leo Van Leer. And we don't have a lot of time for you to ask questions or to make comments, but if there are any things, we can continue the discussion in the forum, obviously, but if there's anything you want to say now, now's your chance.
Do you think there's a step before this empowerment, Scott? I mean, Christian mentioned that, we have to give the floor to students more, and I totally agree. But sometimes I feel that they lack an enablement before empowerment. And that's why we give them the floor, but they don't take it.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And I think, of course, we were talking about language teaching as if it was just another kind of teaching, like geography or math or history or whatever, but it's different because we're teaching the subject through the target language most of the time. And therefore, there's a huge constraint on learners taking initiative because they don't have the words. They don't know what to say. They're dying to ask the question. I mean, unless we are teaching in a monolingual context, we say, well, ask me in Turkish or ask me in Portuguese or whatever. But so we need to teach them how to ask the questions. We need to teach them the language that facilitates or enables, as you say, them to be more participatory. And so this is, again, coming back to process. It's what some writers call process language, the language of the classroom. How often do we teach them to ask questions like, what does X mean? Or can you write that, please? Or how do you spell it? I mean, we do. Good teachers always do. And they have around the room, they'll have the, cues of the questions, these kinds of questions are incredibly important because, it's absolutely, you're absolutely right. It's all very well saying to students, oh, I want you to be more participatory. When they say, well, but we don't know, we don't have the language. Okay. Girish, I'm just looking at your question. There's a sense of control and control to similar in a teaching context. I'm not sure, Girish, do you want to expand?
In one of your slides, I read there was a mentioning of a sense of control. It did not say control.
Okay.
Is that deliberate?
Maybe. I'll have to go back. I can't remember which one it was, but the learners need a sense of control. I think they need and this comes back to structure too. They need a sense of structure. You can't just go in randomly. And this is why dogma has got such a bad press, because it's believed by people who don't know anything about it that it's unstructured. That I'm just going to go and I'm going to chat with the students, and if something comes up, it comes up. But no, there does need to be structure. There needs to be perception, a sense of control. It's just as like when we go to a concert, we need, if we're paid good money, and if we just think the musicians are going to sit there jamming for 2 hours, then we will feel slightly cheated. I mean, that's the other extreme, of course. We have no control in that case, but there's probably a happy But yeah,
That's
I'll
how I
need
was
to go back.
connecting. That's how I was connecting the two dots, where we were discussing about control and initiative, and Civic says that 100% control is with the teacher. And maybe I thought that's why the term has been coined, a sense of control. The learner has a sense of control,
Yes.
but the control is actually still in the teacher's hand.
Okay, exactly. That might, yeah, that's an interesting thought, because it could be considered to be a little bit, what's the word, duplicitous, that you're kind of
Just like
making, making, it's like giving a dog a sense of freedom by taking it outside, but it's still on a leash. Yeah, interesting. And I think this is all about authenticity. So, you know, his awareness, autonomy, and authenticity, the 3 A's, are part of what he calls this kind of reformed curriculum. And I think authenticity would include that we shouldn't be doing things that are inauthentic, in the sense that they are, the students are being somehow misled, yeah, or not given full autonomy. But it is a process. I mean, it's not going to be achieved overnight for all the reasons that we've said. And yes, it's like, that would be jazz, exactly, James, going in. But even jazz, you know, it's not just, I mean, you know, traditional jazz, as I understand it, at least, there is a song, you know, it's like a Gershwin song, and then they riff on the thing, but you pick up, I just heard it again, the melody, and as opposed to Ornette Coleman, or, you know, but anyway. Any other points or questions, folks? We're kind of slightly out of time here. I shall post a follow-up task. Perhaps we can pursue some of these discussions. We'll go back and look at the discussion, the pre-session task. But otherwise, I'll have to say goodbye until next week. And remember, it's the Freeman. It's the Freeman article, but do come with your questions about anything else that's come up that you would like to discuss or follow up on. And that's it for today. Enjoy the rest of the day, those of you who've got day left. I'm going out to lunch to have my Sicilian pizza.
Right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody. Bye.
Bye.